Welcome! You are listening to audio from the table. If you'd like to learn more about our community or donate to this ministry, please visit thetabletx.com.
Table Podcast listeners, Brett here, grace and peace. Glad to be with you all. So we are in, part 5 of our series titled The Book of James. We're just taking a few weeks to look at the major themes, insights from this delightful book of the New Testament. And the title of the message this week is The Overlooked Secret to Wisdom. Our passage is from James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. James writes, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such so-called wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." So there's a story in the Bible of a young man in his very early 20s, some scholars even speculate maybe teens. His name was Solomon. And he was in the midst of a tremendous transition. His father, King David, had passed away, and now Solomon will be the next king of Israel. So he goes to sleep one night, and the Lord appears to him in a dream and says, "Solomon, ask whatever you want, and I will give it to you." And Solomon's answer is absolutely incredible. It's probably one of the really just like the highlights of the scriptures. So Solomon responds in this way. He says, "O Lord, I'm only a little child, and I do not know how to carry out my duties. Give me a discerning heart to govern your people, to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" And the Lord then responds, "Solomon, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart." The first time I heard that story, I was young, it was Sunday school, maybe 6, 7, 8 years old. And of course, stories like this are always very popular in Sunday school because, well, it's a story and not some abstract, teaching. And I can remember being extremely unimpressed by Solomon's answer. I was like, what a disaster of an answer. Like, he could have had so much money. My 8-year-old brain just couldn't comprehend a better life than one full of like sports cars and candy bars. That's what he should have asked for. A lifetime supply of Butterfingers. Of course, now at almost 40, I can see that I was the idiot. For is there anything more beautiful than wisdom, perspective, discernment, to know what to do at the time it's needed, to know what to say or not to say at the time it is needed? Like, that is a gift. Wisdom is a gift to you. It brings a certain peace and inner alignment. It's a gift to your family. It's a gift to your community, to your church. Everyone you come in contact with. And of course, the prophets, the poets, the seers, they've been telling us this for thousands of years. I think of the book of Proverbs, of course, more valuable than rubies and precious stones is wisdom. More desirable than mansions and cars is wisdom. Pursue wisdom. And yet, so few have it. Why? Why is this? And kind of maybe another question is, how? How do we cultivate a life of wisdom? So in verse 13 in our passage, James writes, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility That's our key word for tonight. Humility that comes from wisdom. Now, this translation kind of emphasizes that humility flows from wisdom, but actually the original language is a bit more ambiguous, which is why other translations will say things like, do deeds done in the humility of wisdom. Like, in other words, what James seems to be emphasizing here is that wisdom and humility always go together. And if you read the rest of the passage and keep this word humility in mind, you'll notice, like, really the whole passage of James here is like a contrast to the humble person, right? It's like the opposite of this. So verse 14, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, he says, do not boast about it or deny the truth. I mean, that language, right? Selfish ambition, boasting. You can hear how it's flying in the face of real wisdom, right? Which is why verse 15, he says now he does scare quotes around wisdom. Such wisdom, so-called wisdom, does not come down from heaven. It's earthly, it's unspiritual, it's demonic. For where you have envy and, here it is again, selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice, right? So in other words, there's this kind of false wisdom. We might say it's the wisdom of the world, but it's rooted in what? In humility? No, the opposite. It's rooted in selfish ambition. It's rooted in getting ahead. It's like cleverness. If I had $1 for every YouTube video I've seen devoted to helping people get ahead of the competition in clever ways, I'd be a rich man. If I had $1 for every Instagram reel or TikTok video with a headline with this language of like dominance and winning, especially in politics and religion. Like, have you ever seen captions like this? Atheist owned by Christian apologist. Conservative humiliated by liberal. Snowflake college student crushed by conservative scholar. See, this language of dominance and winning kind of gives it away. Like, this is what we're seeking. We want the knowledge that crushes our enemies. We want the insight, the secret that will help us get ahead of the others. It's a false wisdom. It's fake. Because what is it lacking? Humility. Here's kind of what I'm driving at. This is our big idea for this message. You cannot scale the mountain of wisdom without first descending into the valley of humility. You might say that humility is always goes with wisdom. It maybe even is a prerequisite for wisdom. Like, you can't take the class titled 201 Wisdom until you take Humility 101. And why would this be? I want to offer 3 reasons in this message. First is that humility leads to wisdom because it opens me to learning. I mean, that seems pretty basic, right? You want to be wise? Probably going to have to be open to learning. I'm reminded of Solomon's opening words to the Lord in his dream, which, by the way, that whole story is from 1 Kings chapter 3. So in verse 7, Solomon says, "But I'm only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties." Boy, that's the most unheard, unused, maybe we could say underutilized phrase in the English language. I don't know. When was the last time you even heard someone say, like, I don't know? Many years ago, there was a wise Zen master. People from far and near would seek his counsel and ask for his wisdom. And one day, a very important man, a scholar known for his vast knowledge, came to visit this spiritual master. And with a bit of a haughty tone, the scholar said, "I've come today to have you teach me about Zen. Open my mind to enlightenment." And the Zen master smiled and said, let's discuss this matter over a cup of tea. So the tea was served, and the master took the kettle and poured his visitor a cup. He poured until the tea rose to the rim, and then it began to spill all over the table, and finally it began to flow onto the robes of this renowned scholar. until he shouted, "Enough! You're spilling the tea all over the place. Can't you see the cup is full? Stop it!" And the master stopped pouring and smiled at his guest. He said, "Like this cup, you are full of your own ideas and opinions. How can I teach you anything unless you first empty your cup?" Church, empty your cup. You want to be wise? You've got to empty your cup. I heard someone say that smart people learn 3 new ideas a day, but wise people let go of 3 ideas a day. There's something about being curious, being open. You might even say kind of unlearning so that we can learn afresh and anew. By the way, this is one, I'd say, good side to the path of deconstruction, which some of you are on, this journey of questioning what you know. It's kind of a form of emptying your cup. It's hard, isn't it? But boy, it can really lead to wisdom. All right, number 2, humility leads to wisdom because it opens me to self-awareness. St. Isaac the Syrian said, "The person who has attained to knowledge of their own weakness has reached the summit of humility." The person who has attained to knowledge of their own weakness has reached the summit of humility. I think this also kind of clarifies what humility is actually all about. See, humility is not self-rejection, or humiliating, demeaning self-talk where we say, like, "I'm nothing, I'm trash, I'm terrible. Oh, look how humble I am." Like, no, humility is simply a deep and profound knowledge of who I am, my weaknesses as well as my strengths. But of course, the trick is we are mostly mysteries unto ourselves. We don't know why we do what we do. I mean, heck, we often don't know, like, even how we come across to others. We're massively lacking self-awareness. There was a study published in the Harvard Business Review. A number of researchers from a variety of institutions, they all came together to study self-awareness. They did actually a number of different studies. They did like 10 different studies. They covered like 5,000 participants. And there was a few takeaways. One thing they noticed right off the bat was that going into the study, nearly all of the participants considered themselves self-aware. They found basically like 85 to 90% said, yes, we are self-aware. But after the study, what they realized was that only 10 to 15% actually were, like literally the exact inverse. So 85 to 90% said, we are self-aware, and precisely 85 to 90% were not. Like, this is a little bit scary, because I think probably if I did like a little poll of, all of our listeners, like, who's self-aware, I would raise my hand. But it kind of gets you to thinking like, maybe not. Now, this, of course, begs the question, well, how do you grow in self-awareness? And interestingly, they found that a certain amount of introspection can be of some help. Think of like classic spiritual practices, journaling, prayer, meditation, right? Kind of going within, going into your subconscious a little bit, that can be helpful. But actually, the researchers' primary suggestion was that if you want to grow in self-awareness, you need to get feedback from other people. Now, to put it in my own words, in short, to grow in wisdom, I need consistent, loving, and honest feedback from people I trust about the way I'm showing up in the world. Now, maybe you're thinking like, how do I even go about doing that? I think it's really as simple as just taking someone you trust and just simply asking them, like, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses? Please be honest. I promise I won't be upset. And of course, you could do that with a boss, with a spouse, with even your kids. I did this with my kids a while back. And I said basically, like, what's something, like, in the way I relate to you that's unhelpful, but I'm unaware of it? And each of them actually said, you get too angry. And I was like, no, I don't. Okay. I don't think I did that. But, right. And well, actually that brings up another point. You have to ask for this feedback. And here's the trick. Believe them. Right? This is why we're not self-aware. This is why we struggle with humility and thus with wisdom. Is like we really think we know. We're convinced, like, I'm an expert on me. I know who I am. I know how I come across. I know what's driving me. I totally get it. And nope. Nope. We don't. So you got to ask for the feedback and then actually believe them. All right, third and finally, humility leads to wisdom because it opens me to the Christian tradition. The way I really wrestled the last few weeks with how to phrase and kind of frame this. But I'll just say that I think we're still, as a culture, we're living in the aftershocks of the European Enlightenment. That's like the age of reason, the age of science, the age of skepticism. And one of the core beliefs of the Enlightenment was that this notion of anything of tradition, like even just the notion of tradition, especially religious tradition, was like the worst. Just stupid, silly, superstition. And I mean, that was sort of the whole purpose of the Enlightenment, was to overcome our silly traditions. And so over and against tradition, you had this elevation of reason and of the individual. You actually can even see this kind of in Christianity in the rise of the Protestant Reformation and its emphasis upon the Bible, Scripture, and individual readers of Scripture, where it's like, hey, I don't want any of that tradition stuff. I certainly don't want to know how others have read this Bible. I'm going to read it for myself. It's sort of a Christianized version of this sort of secular idea. And yet, like, I just asked the question, how is this working for us? Like, I do think there was, at least initially, some good has come from it, in the sense that, I mean, certainly it's kind of humbled Christendom and kind of brought it to an end in a lot of ways. And yet, as I look across the landscape of my peers and younger, what I see are a largely rootless people, right? We don't want anything to do with the church, but we don't know where else to turn. And so we just sort of turn to nothingness. Like we just sort of, we're just kind of making our lives up as we go. And maybe we listen to like a few podcasts or, read the occasional book, but we're disconnected from any sort of embodied tradition. No actual flesh and blood support, no very ancient teachings, certainly no accountability. What are we lacking? A tradition. You see, religious traditions, they're carriers of wisdom. And so what I'm contending is, like, I think it's time for us to start re-engaging the tradition. And here's what I mean when I say Christian tradition. I'm not talking about like the quirky individual doctrines or things that certain churches do. Like, well, we, baptize infants, or we don't, or we sing from hymn books, or we have guitar. I don't mean those traditions. I'm talking about the Christian tradition as a whole. The way I define it is an ongoing conversation and practice across time about Christ, God, the truth, the good, and how to live wisely and well. And I think we all desperately need a tradition. Of course, I really love Christ and love the Christian tradition, and we're a church, so I'm suggesting that we engage this tradition. But if you're like, well, I don't want anything to do with the Christian tradition, well, honestly, I would just rather you engage any freaking tradition at all. Like, I'll take it. You know what I mean? Just whatever you want, like something, please, but not this sort of, I'm just gonna float. Like, oh no, it's like dooming yourself. I mean, like, just to take a totally different example, like, let's say you wanted to learn to surf, but you decided from the outset, because, you're a good, like, secular Enlightenment person. You're like, I am not going to submit myself to the tradition of surfing. Nope. No mentors, no community. I don't want to learn the history of surfing. Nothing. No articles, no input, just me, my board in the ocean. I'm just going to learn all this from scratch. Like, can you see, like, it just doesn't freaking make sense. No, you will go further if you immerse yourself in the tradition and actually wrestle with it. I would say this is one way in which, kind of the table in general, but for sure me personally, I'm definitely wildly out of step with many Christians and certainly the broader secular culture. Most people, of course, as I've said, they just don't think they need a religious tradition to live wisely and well. And while I recognize the dangers in religious traditions, I mean, of course, oh my goodness, there's bad things in any tradition. I also think that humbling ourselves and admitting, look, I'm just a human being. I can't know it all or learn it all or make it all up from scratch. I need a tradition. I need to engage the big conversation and practice happening across time. I need to glean from the learnings of previous generations. I need roots. I need roots, deep roots, so that I can grow well. I need a sparring partner, because it's not just about, right, just swallowing the tradition hook, line, and sinker, whatever Mother Church says, whatever the Pope or Pastor Brett or Bishop so-and-so says, that's what I believe. No, you wrestle with it. You argue with it. You also listen to it. You learn from it, right? What I'm getting at, we all need a tradition to help introduce us to the way of Jesus Christ. Now, I get that that's a hard, if I said earlier, deconstruction can kind of help in the sense of, opening you to unlearning and relearning. This is maybe where deconstruction can be difficult, because at some point we have to kind of put down our sword and actually say okay, there's no perfect tradition here, but I've got to engage something. And I think Christ and the Christian tradition, there is so much beauty and goodness here. So much. I'm just imploring you, don't give up on it. There is something beautiful here. But again, if you're in a place where I just can't do the Christian thing, okay, then please find a different tradition. Something. All right, so that's the message. Humility leads to wisdom because it opens me to learning. It opens me to self-awareness. It opens me to the Christian tradition as a whole. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.